I'm now joined by Marc Laferriere, a councillor for the County of Brant, and Adam McDonald, who is a research and consultant. Hi guys, thanks for joining me today.
Hey Patty, thanks for having us.
Hi Patty, thanks for having us on.
The reason why I asked you both to be involved in this is you're kind of my go-to guys when it comes to policy and government and how things function. So I find that Adam has a way of breaking it down in a way that we can all understand, and Marc, with his experience both with federal, provincial, and now municipal, I think that you can really help people understand how things function, governments function in general, and certainly during a crisis like this. So Marc, I'll start with you. Can you talk about how the county is adjusting to not being able to meet in person?
Yeah, it's really interesting timing because we actually just had a number of really popular maybe the wrong word, but community consultations where lots of folks attended about controversial subjects. So right before this, we had the biggest meeting in the history of the county. Over 500 people showed up, and now we're looking at doing business a little differently, not because of that was great, but because of an inability to meet in large groups, let alone groups right now, but even into the future. So we're already talking about what are we going to do in the future when we have those community consultations and how will we do them. In terms of actually governing right now, we have had meetings. We're having one in early May. We've had one in April, teleconference, and then we're moving hopefully to Zoom or Teams or another visual medium, because when we start looking at things like planning committees where we need to be able to see documents, it's tough when some folks get them printed and it's page 73 of the PDF, and other folks they have it on a tablet and it's page 68, and we have very technical questions for our staff in that way. So we're starting off with, in the state of emergency, with telephone conferences, telephone meetings. There's some prep to that. There's test calls that people don't see, and then we get into the actual calls that are public and streamed on YouTube, and then moving towards more and more of that. Now we're going to have to, the next thing we're going to have to do is find a way to get constituents to be able to present and experts to present at these meetings as well, and hopefully that'll happen in the virtual space.
And now Adam, can you explain, when something comes to council, there's committee of the whole, there's committee social services, there's all these committees, and then it goes through these series of meetings and then finally ends up at a council for a vote. A lot of people don't understand that process. Can you shed some light on it?
Well, sure. It's really designed to help to focus whatever the issue is at hand. So when an issue comes to City Council, it's usually very broad-based. We want to put a street light on this corner, or we want to create a dog park, or whatever it happens to be. And so the issue is first considered by a committee, a specialized committee, like a social policy committee or a transportation committee, to take a look carefully at the proposal and to try to tear it apart with some expertise. That committee then makes their recommendation to the Committee of the Whole, and that's the short name for the Committee of the Whole Council, whose job it is to again consider the proposal as amended by the first committee, but without as many of the rules attached to them as would be at a formal council procedure. So essentially, it's a council meeting in committee form. Once they've pulled apart and amended the proposal, it then goes to the full City Council for its procedures, for its specific procedures, and its specific formula for dealing with issues. So then you have the public hearing element, and you have the various readings of a particular proposed bylaw, and all the rest of it. But what distinguishes each level there is the expertise applied to the proposal and the procedures that each level follows when considering, debating, and questioning that particular policy.
And so if you have questions, they come through the Committee of the Wholes, right, Marc? They don't come into, during the actual council process, can they still question staff? Like, how does that work if it's actually brought straight to council and sort of in these emergency situations, some councils are only meeting as a council?
So right now, generally what's happening, I know in our community, is something can be brought up by a committee member, so it's a council member, or generally it's being brought up by staff. And because it's a state of emergency, we aren't having the committee meetings and the rest of it. Now, the good news about those committee meetings, and the reason they work, as Adam was saying, is because it also gives the people who are making the decisions a little bit more expertise, but it also gives them and the community time to interject. So we'll see something, for example, planning, and it'll come back to us 2, 3, 4, 6 months later, and that's given everybody a little time to breathe with the material, right? It also gives the person, the proponent of whatever is going on, whether it's a dog park or something else, a chance to hear concerns and adapt and change and modify the proposal before it gets approved. And in this state of emergency, where, like I was saying kind of earlier, is we're trying to adapt to those processes, or adapt those processes to the current technological and emergency issues that are happening. So it's really tough, because we are really dealing with issues based on safety and health and business continuity. So business continuity for businesses, yes, but also for the business of a municipality. So things like relief, things like setting up funds to be able to provide relief and to make sure our systems are still operating. There's some things we have to make sure we attend to, things like water, so we don't have a Walkerton type situation, and health and safety, paramedics in terms of the county. We operate the paramedics for both the city and the county. So we're not having a paramedic committee meeting, for example, but we are able to discuss those issues at committee of a whole council in order to get things still through. However, as things ease up, and Premier Ford was talking about this recently, and we don't quite know when that's going to be, but as things ease up, then we're going to have to adapt, because again, we're not going to have, my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, we're not going to have 500 people at a community hall for the next year or plus, right? We may have groups of 10 or 20, or people videotaping or sending letters through as a way to interject, and we might have to slow up some processes too, right? Because if people have to write and videotape things, then we need to give them the opportunity to rebut, to adapt. So things might come back to cycle 2 or 3 times instead of once or twice, right? And I think that's kind of prudent in these times.
Now, Ontario legislature works differently, and they have a majority government. So, Adam, is it easier in their way to pass whatever they need to do? Because really, they can make the decisions, and it doesn't have to be passed by anybody but their own party.
Well, not quite. I mean, the Ontario legislature has its own set of the rules, and the rules govern how sittings are accomplished, and the rules govern how you give notice out to MPPs. So if the Ford government, let me back up a step actually. The legislature has given Cabinet some extraordinary powers because of the emergency. So Cabinet can do a whole lot of things without any kind of consultation right now because of the emergency. Those powers last roughly 28 days at a time. So the emergency powers can be renewed by the legislature once a month. And for that to happen, the legislature has to meet. For the legislature to meet, the Speaker of the House sends out a letter to all 124 MPPs. Everyone gets to find out about it, and they come into Parliament. The 3 parties together work out an agreement to figure out how many of each party are actually going to come into the room because of the physical distancing requirements under the public health advice. So they have to come to an agreement before the House meets to consider whatever they have to consider. Otherwise, you could have a scenario, in theory, where the government has 8 people in the room and the opposition parties have 25 because they decided they didn't care for physical distancing and wanted to defeat the government. That's not what is happening. The 3 parties are working very closely together to ensure that everyone has a voice while respecting the relative positions of each party in the legislature. Your point about a majority government is important because Premier Ford doesn't have the right, but can feel confident that the legislature is going to pass whatever he puts forward. It's important to remember, though, that each MPP still has a vote, and an MPP a conservative MPP could, if they wanted to, vote against the government if they didn't think it was in the best interests of Ontario or their communities.
And now moving to federal government, it's a completely different scenario, right? Because you have a minority government who's working to sort of strike deals before they even go into voting. So there's been a lot of talk about how MPs are feeling like they can't ask questions of Trudeau because they're not being included, and they want less virtual meetings and more in-person meetings. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that comes into play in terms of how often they meet and why they can't necessarily make decisions in these virtual settings?
Yeah, there's a whole lot going on, and some of this applies to the Ontario legislature, and some of it is specific to the Parliament of Canada. First, the stuff that applies to both. Parliamentary privilege, that is the rights and privileges of MPPs and MPs, are sacrosanct when it comes to meetings of Parliament. Parliamentary privilege trumps a lot of stuff. A police officer can't pull an MP over who's speeding to get to a vote, for example. That would be against the law. You can't impede an MP or an MPP from getting into Queen's Park or the Parliament buildings because they have a responsibility to discharge as an elected official. So that's an important element when we're thinking about virtual meetings and how Parliament meets, because you have to make sure every single member of that assembly either has the right, or rather has the ability to attend, or has given up that ability in the name of physical distancing. So, when the parties get together and agree that there are going to be so many people from each party in the chamber, that's each member also agreeing to that. We saw a case federally where a couple of MPs didn't agree with what their parties had done, and they walked into the chamber anyway. That really upset the balance of what the parties had agreed to do. But it was within the rights of those MPs to do what they did, because they have a right and a responsibility to vet what the government is doing. That's Parliament's role, is to vet what the government's doing. In the case of the federal government, the situation is complicated because it's a minority situation. And we saw a scenario where the government arguably tried to ask for more power than it really needed to deal with the emergency, where the Trudeau government was asking Parliament to give it broad taxing authority for a couple of years without having to report back to Parliament in any shape or form. Opposition parties said, no, wait a minute. Parliament's job is to scrutinize this, and you're taking advantage of an emergency. So there's some trust issues going on there. The final element is constitutional, which is that the Constitution of Canada says you have to have the presence of 20 MPs to hold a sitting of the House of Commons. What does presence mean? Up until recently, and even in the orders that govern how Parliament works, it's been assumed a physical body in a specific physical desk. And that's true of both Ontario and the federal government, where the rules require that an MP or MPP speak from their desk. Otherwise, it doesn't count. The vote doesn't count. So virtual meetings are a little problematic in that way, because they don't allow you to be in a physical space. They don't allow you to be together in the room. And there's an added component of whether the MP is being coerced when they're sitting at their desk. You can see me on the screen right now. You can see the bookshelves behind me, but you can't see what's on the other side of my computer. Is there somebody pointing a weapon at me? Am I being threatened or in some way?
Do we need to call somebody, Adam?
I'll tap my nose twice.
Thanks.
But the reality is that when you're dealing with matters of national or provincial interest, you want to be sure that the person casting a vote is doing so of their own free will. And it's harder to ascertain that from a virtual capacity.
Yeah, if I can interject, there's kind of a larger issue at play here too about society and the role of Parliament in terms of leadership, right? So Parliament is asking folks to innovate. They're asking educational institutions to innovate. They're asking businesses to innovate, to do some very similar things, right? And part and parcel of the whole, things are happening in that way. In fact, the provincial government gave powers to municipal government to meet virtually for the first time in history. So because they knew that we needed to meet, and we needed to meet in new ways to respect physical distancing. Also, elected bodies hold a leadership position of showing and not just telling, right? It's one thing to, and this is where Trudeau got in a little bit of trouble of, stay home, but not me necessarily. And Scheer did the same thing, and that's tough. And now you're telling folks because there is some pressure, and it's coming from one political party right now to meet. We all have to meet. We should meet like we were, which, when you're telling people to stay indoors, when you have a bunch of folks out there with a hoaxer mentality that this is a big hoax, it sends a weird double message to also have 338 plus people travel all across the country to go to, they can't go to church that way, but they could come to Parliament and then disperse again throughout the country, or isolate in one space like Ottawa and potentially see Ottawa have an uptick in COVID-19. And, when they're traveling in, Charlie Angus is a friend of mine, and he was posting today about how he's driving from, Timmins James Bay to Ottawa today. And this is also the day of mourning for, people who are injured, killed, or made sick on the job. And, we have to start thinking about these things in a different way. And Parliament has, in my opinion, and all levels of government have a responsibility to show the innovation and to show folks the seriousness of what's going on, because things are getting a little lax, and we're going to see some numbers potentially rise because of that. So maybe now is the time to look at changing rules, at least in an emergency state, to really think through some of the best practices. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are other parliaments all over the world who are doing things like this right now, and we can as well. We're a very vast country, but this idea of, hundreds of people congregating in one small room to then congregate back out, that's dangerous. And it's not just them, it's the staff, it's the security staff, it's the people in the airports and the gas stations. It's a bigger issue. So doing the proportional thing, and I don't mean proportional representation, but I mean a form of it, which is, we have a proportion of Liberals, Conservatives, New Democrats, Greens, Bloc, and we're going to have a proportion, and we're going to do best practices to get folks there that maybe is based on where they live and their proximity to Parliament, right? Or looking at virtual meetings. The committees are doing virtual meetings. They're doing virtual videos, getting information virtually, and voting at the committee level in a virtual manner. Why not Parliament? And by the way, how much of this, we have to talk about this piece, how much of this is trying to find some political gain in an emergency, right? Do we really need Parliament to meet, or do we need it to meet in an adapted way? Because it's if this was a war, would we accept mail-in ballots? Right, we probably would.
To be fair, in wartime, Parliament met. In fact, Parliament met while the English Parliament met while London was being bombed. Canada's Parliament met all through the war. So I mean, it's a bit of a tough comparison to make, because of course you didn't have the physical distancing issue.
But you also didn't have to be fair, you also didn't have the technology to be able to do things as instantaneously as you did now. So there was a greater necessity to meet physically than there might be now with
also true. Yeah,
technology.
The element that is confounding Parliament to a certain extent is constitutional stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Right, the province with a wave of its hand can give municipalities power to do things. It's easy for them to say, County of Brant, go do your thing. City of Brantford, go do your thing.
We're also 11 people, right? So it's
right.
easier in terms of safety, and we could all meet in one office building very, very distantly and still follow physical distancing rules. However, we're choosing to meet virtually because that actually is even safer.
For sure. The issue with Parliament is twofold at this point. One is, where do you marry the constitutional rights and responsibilities of Parliament against public safety? Mm-hmm. And the other critical element, I mean, Mark, you raised it a moment ago, is the politics of it. The opposition parties were very clearly willing to give the government a lot of room at the very beginning of all of this. When the government chose to, again, arguably overreach, some trust got lost. And so now parliamentarians are saying, okay, we have a role here where we have to scrutinize you, because when you're left to your own devices, you might do something like this.
That said, Parliament also, there was a correction of that without necessarily having to bring all of Parliament back. And so the system still worked. And now on the other side of things, you have one party, the Conservatives led by Scheer, who are, I think, trying to make political hay out of something in a way that is maybe not as bad as what the Liberals try to do in terms of power grab, but it's a grab of its own, and there's an element of misinformation there about distancing, and so it's dangerous too. And it's there's a lack of trust, and then there's another lack of trust in the counter, right? Because the rest of the parties are agreeing, the rest of the parties are trying to make it work in terms of, and so are the Conservatives to a degree, but they're also pushing for this the messaging about it, like they're not working or something. Like, look, Harper and she are both, you know, they both govern during times of prorogation, and prorogation is different. It stops and pauses bills. It's often done for very political reasons and not for state of emergency reasons like this. So I have a hard time kind of squaring that. It's very simple to say that folks aren't working and they're not working and you have to and they don't, and that's not really what's happening.
No.
You know, what's happening here, MPs, including our own and so many others, they're doing really important work back home, right? They're trying to help people navigate through CERB, they're meeting with local businesses about business continuity. They're in a position to really be helping and listening at home, to be able to advocate for federal or provincial supports and to connect folks in really important ways, and connect folks and materials like PPE, right? So there's a lot there. This idea that, you know, they only work when they're at the office, well, then they should be in Parliament, 7 days a week, every month, and they're not. You know, Parliament goes on big breaks for other reasons, and parliamentary break is not a break of the work of an MP. And I know you both know this, but I think it's really important to reiterate this.
Oh, I agree, and I do see that misinformation circulate. I mean, I'm involved in watching stories and everything else like you, and this is why I wanted. Oops, I hit my computer. This is why I wanted to have the conversation with the two of you, because I think it's really important to explain how things work, because not all of us have that education or background in that, and we're very quick, that people are very quick to criticize our elected people, and most that I know are in it for the right reasons. And I think that, you know, ultimately to serve, we should have a little bit more respect. We can ask questions, but some of the things that I've seen have just been really nasty comments, and I don't think that there's any place for that in a situation like this, most certainly. I just want to shift our focus here to talking about the economy. And you know, you're seeing in the States that they set some groundwork on how the states could reopen, and states are reopening not even following that groundwork. Now, Canada is going to lay out some rules, or so to speak, guidelines on how each province can operate and reopen. And you know, you're seeing some movement in New Brunswick, and Quebec yesterday made some announcements on, Doug Ford released his plan without dates, but how we're going to reopen the economy. What do you think about each province having their own choice in how they move forward?
Well, I mean, I think part of the issue is constitutional. Provinces have responsibility for some of the fundamental things that we're talking about here: hospitals, schools, social services, how we congregate, where we congregate, municipalities. So the things that are all shut down are, by and large, provincial responsibilities. So the federal government doesn't have a formal say under the current scenario here, which means provinces have to be able to make those decisions. To an extent, that makes a lot of sense, right? Provinces are dealing with their own local issues. You have different levels of outbreak across different borders. You have different pieces involved here. So from a procedural perspective, it's very, very appropriate. However, a country the size of Canada, and a country that has as much ability to move across provincial borders as Canada, think, for example, Ottawa-Gatineau, think about the maritime provinces and how easy it is to get from one spot to the other. I think that requires a certain level of coordination. But in the end, you know, if the federal government wants to coordinate and the provincial premier disagrees, the provincial premier gets the final say.
I think it makes sense for folks to try to harmonize as best they can, but there will be differences even within provinces. You know, here's an example that's not to do with COVID, but if you live in the north, you don't have to get your, well, in the past you didn't have to get your emissions check, because there's different dynamics, including environmentally, to the north, right, than there is to the more congested areas of the province. So, I mean, we have had regional differences even within provincial jurisdictions. Heck, look at Brantford-Brant. We have a lot more of a rural community in the county and a lot more of an urban community in the city. And not everything should apply the same way, because there are going to be different issues there. That said, to take from Adam, that said, you know, I think people are also kind of losing sight of the importance of what's going on, because the novelty has worn off of isolation. And I hate to say it that way, but there was some novel pieces to this. And people are, you know, itching out of need in part and out of want, in another part to get back to going, get the economy back to where it needs to be, which is all fair and fine, but we have to be really careful. I mean, as we record this, we did just see the highest death toll in the country. We're not out of the woods. I mean, in our community, we've seen a pretty decent flattening of the curve, to be honest. Testing has gone up, and yet, you know, we only have 30-something active cases, more resolved than, more behind us than ahead of us, you know, for right now. But that can change very, very quickly. And that's the problem with this COVID-19, is that the transmission rates are really high, and we haven't seen the overrunning of the hospitals and the healthcare system that we had prepared for. But that's also why we prepared for it. We're lucky. In other communities not that far from us, they have seen an overrunning of their healthcare systems, the regional healthcare system. So we have to be really, really careful, and we also have to make sure that our relief efforts are well coordinated federally, provincially, and municipally. That's something I was just on the phone with our CAO about. You know, we're not making any big decisions in terms of relief right now because the province might have a great relief package 6 months from now, or they might spell out some rules and some funding that makes sense that we'll be working across purposes. So there is still a wait and see approach. As we open things up, there will be as well. And again, this is not, this has changed things. You know, this isn't going to be like, well, even 3 months from now, everything's going to be normal, whatever normal was. New normal's kind of played out, but you know, we're talking about you know, a year or two. Look at what's happened with 9/11 and the travel industry, right? That's still changed from that. And that was, you know, well over a decade ago. We're going on almost 2 decades now, right? This is where we're, you know, there are going to be big changes. Are people going to want to go to concerts in 2 years, even if they can, right? Whatever it might be. And that's where we have to start really being forward thinking, but also kind of have to hold the line right now. This is not the time to start jumping.
One thing that has come out, and I know, Marc, with your background in social work, and Adam, with your background in helping nonprofits and your previous experience in working with MPPs, there's a lot of disparity. Things are showing, there's cracks in the armor in programs that many of us and many people have talked about for a long time that just weren't as obvious, let's just say that. Long-term care is a prime example of something that was underfunded. Our healthcare, cuts to healthcare in general. There's been some relief programs from both provincial and feds. Do you see any holes in those? Who do you see being left out? Where are the people that are not getting what they need?
Well, I mean, it's a tough question, right? Because you could argue that there are always going to be people left out. You draw a line for a program somewhere, and someone is on the wrong side of that line. And government is fundamentally about choices, and governments make choices based on what they understand both the will of the people is, and the best way to govern a particular jurisdiction. So there's always going to be somebody left out. The emergency responses are, I'll call them knee-jerk reactions. They're quick reactions to say, we need to do something because this is going to blow up on our faces and everyone's face. So if something has to happen, it has to happen now, it has to happen fast. We saw this with the initial federal government responses, and we've seen the federal government responses change a little bit almost every day because people are being left out. They are tweaking the programs. They're making sure that we don't have the unintended consequences of missing a critical group that does or does not need help. It's a philosophical question in a lot of ways. What is the role of government versus what is the role of the market? And you know, I've heard it said recently that Doug Ford has caught socialism virus because of the money being shoveled out the door. I don't think anybody's arguing anywhere that he's doing the wrong thing by shoveling government money out the door. The real question is going to be, how do we perceive the role of government after the pandemic is over? And are we going to see further clawbacks, or are we going to apply the lessons from the pandemic to how we approach government systemic approaches to funding? You know, we hear a lot of talk as an obvious example of universal basic income, which is essentially what CERB is. It's essentially what the governments are providing right now. Is it worth more discussion after the pandemic? I don't know. But I do think it's important to have those discussions about the role of government, to try to clarify our own thoughts now that we've all lived through something like this, where government was more important than almost anything else.
During worldwide issues, this is where we see social programs tend to actually get boosted, and afterwards. So we have an affordable housing system in Canada because we had World War II and veterans came home and said, you're not housing us and you promised us housing, right? It wasn't done for the old ladies and who were widowers, or widows. It wasn't done for the kids. It's become a place where we see a high proportion of single parents and single moms mostly, and kids, but that's not what it was designed for. It was designed as a way to deal with a social issue from a group that we saw as deserving. So this is in a social work capacity when we have these things of Adam talks about the line one way or the other, but I look at it from a social work perspective of we have these antiquated notions of the deserving and undeserving, right? The deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And when more people are economically affected, we suddenly have a bigger definition of who is deserving and undeserving of social help. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's how we act as a society, at least in this society. But there have been a lot of folks, myself included, banging a drum for a very long time about the holes in long-term care, right? About the need for a changing economy, about the need for energy self-reliance. Look, oil's at like less than zero right now. And, we've been talking about, some of us have been talking about why we should be subsidizing other forms of energy instead of oil for a very long time. Like, you don't have to be the amazing Kreskin, I know I sound old when I say that, in order to see some of these issues, but people needed to have listened, and hopefully more people will listen and we'll find a better balance in our economy. And that's the piece, right? There is always going to be a line, as Adam said, and I agree with him on that. But what's the balance point? What's the role of government? Is the role of government, we have a capitalistic system, absolutely, but it's a mixed market system here. And the mix needs to have a role for government and a role for private industry. We're not saying take one out. We're saying let's innovate in those ways. And innovation has for a very long time been a code word in government circles for let's find the cheapest way that helps business out the most. And maybe it needs to be, let's find a way that has a nice balance between private industry, the environment, and individuals. And I know theoretically that's what we all strive for, but I think as a society we've seen gaps in systems and gaps in personal income and gaps in affordability that, again, some of us have been banging this drum for a long time. I'm hopeful in some ways that people as a society will have a little more openness to reevaluation of some fundamental concepts in our system. And I don't mean, these wild swings. I mean, stuff we used to do 30 years ago, maybe we should do again, right? Like, I'm not talking about utopia. I'm talking about good services and a social safety net that makes sense for everybody.
I like that. I like that philosophy, and it's always great chatting with you both. I appreciate you being my phone a friend, so to speak, when it comes to politics and policy, and certainly social work as well, Marc. So thanks for joining me today, and best of luck and health to both of you, and hopefully we can chat again soon.
Thanks for having me.